Hello and welcome to AXSChat. I'm delighted to welcome Rob Price and Christopher Joynson today, who are colleagues of mine and Antonio's. Rob and Christopher are both members of our scientific community at Atos and are working on a document called Journey 2022, which is our sort of thought leadership stuff. And their focus is around digital inclusion. They're working on a piece called Digital Society and have been running a large questionnaire over the last few months to gather views on people's attitudes to technology and how inclusive it is. So I think it's broadly aligned with the stuff we're doing here at AXSChat, so it's great to have you with us, guys. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourselves and the work you're doing?
Thanks, Neil. And if I can kind of kick off and then I'll hand across to Christopher. So yeah, Rob Price, part of the scientific community. I guess I've been involved in digital transformation for 10 years or so in business, and probably got to a point where somebody asked me a great question a few weeks ago, which is where's digital transformation that's occurred for the benefit of each of the business and the shareholders and the employees and the consumers. And I think part of that is very much thinking about that balance across all of those, conscious of the degree of change and pace in technology and digital services isn't necessarily taking everyone with it across all parts of society. And therefore our focus has been how do we make sure that we understand better how to close those bridges between some of the emerging technologies that are impacting our lives and everybody for the benefit of everybody, rather than those few who happen to have got access to them or understand them or can afford or whatever that block may be. And so that's why our focus is around digital society and understanding what terms mean like digital divide, and maybe thinking about how the digital divide differs in different geographies or different viewpoints. It all kicked off with a piece of work about a year ago that was done by Christopher. So perhaps if I hand across to Christopher to introduce himself and maybe outline some of that thinking then.
Oh, seamless. So yes, hello everyone. My name's Joynson. I've worked for Atos in just over 2 years now. I first fell in love with this topic really just over a year ago when we did an internal TED Talk style competition at a topic for the presentation was about our senior citizen digital divide in our society. So some of our more senior citizens in society feel much less comfortable with technology than perhaps our more junior peers. The example of my gran, who is terrified by her own words, whereas I have it in my pocket. So I really played on this topic, because we all feel something very different towards technology on a very individual level. And we find that certain elements of our society, perhaps vulnerable people, might have particularly acute feelings towards such technology, but it's universal. Everyone has their own perspectives. So we took that passion. Rob was my mentor for the presentation on the competition, and that took us on to doing this work in the scientific community, where we're looking to understand this digital divide more and see what it actually looks like across the demography.
Thank you, Christopher. Apologies for the slight cutting out of the sound there. I can't even blame our internet for once. So I'm very interested in age and attitudes towards technology too, because obviously age and disability are interrelated. We tend to acquire disabilities as we get older, and people that can benefit from the assistive technologies are probably going to be the least likely to use them, or that's the thinking, or was the traditional thinking. I think that is going to change as people become more confident with technologies. And I think that some of that, as you will have found in your survey, although I won't preempt it, will actually show that even though people are of a similar age and similar generations, attitude counts for a lot. I know this with my parents. My dad is very keen on using technology. He has an iPhone and an iPad, and busy FaceTiming me dressed up as his pantomime character yesterday. I got my dad dressed up as a wolf. FaceTime. So he's confident enough to use the technology, or likes to use it. His attitude is one that he wants to use it. Doesn't mean that there aren't problems using it. So you know, there are barriers to using the technology, but the barrier isn't his attitude towards it. So I'm very interested in both attitudinal and technological barriers, and I think that we probably need to know more about the difference between the two, and find ways to, of course, remove them.
And I think, in a sense, that point around so the divide and the barriers was the thing that we were trying to explore most in the survey that we put together and put out, because, as Christopher says, part of that was about how do we feel, and do we trust, and can we gain personal benefit from these things? How do we use them? But we were just trying to understand how that might differ across age groups, or gender, or education. It's an anonymous survey, but we were just trying to understand where those differences lie, and whether actually the divide was changing over time. So people have talked about very much the divide as accessibility to broadband services, for example. But I'm very conscious that whilst that might be, I mean, the survey says an almost kind of complete response to the survey, people are happy with internet. They are comfortable with the use of the internet. But our view was that there's many more things coming that people can gain benefit from. One we've talked about before, Neil, has been natural voice interaction with AI, effectively. And it's interesting to see how people trust that a device in a room in the house, for example, how comfortable different age groups are of using that device to give them personal benefit. We've talked about it because it would seem an easier thing to use. You don't have to learn how to use a tablet or use a PC. You just talk to it. Particularly what we've found through the survey is that actually there's quite a high percentage of people who really aren't comfortable doing that. And that's true of many of the questions that we've asked, and the technologies that we've asked, is to try and understand where those barriers are. And what's been fascinating is, and we've got a month still to run on the survey, but what's been fascinating is having seen so many people respond from so many different countries. So I think we're at 61 countries now, Christopher, in terms of people who have responded, which is just fantastic in terms of quite humbling, actually, to get that amount of response across the world. But it isn't as simple as the older you are, the least likely you are to be comfortable with a particular technology. There is a strong age divide in many questions, but not always. Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of where the exceptions are where we probably gain most learning to bring back to decisions that we as a business or we as an industry can then better make to be more inclusive in the way in which we build trust and understanding, and value the services that can be provided to the individual. Christopher, is there something you'd add to that?
Only that actually a lot of our feelings end up around our context. So it's what our parents would have done when we're inside them, or it's what our peers do on a daily basis. So actually it's each of our personal and physics that often define how we perceive technology. And I suppose what I'd highlight, talking about this topic for the sake of it, the impact of the digital divide in our society and a lack of community are going to become all the more severe as it's more important in our lives when we start voting using our mobile phones at elections, and when we access our healthcare through FaceTime GP, which we got in London recently. So it's becoming more and more important as technology becomes more and more ubiquitous in our lives.
I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I know that I was going to ask you, and then you answered the question, Rob. You know, how many countries were participating? Because when I think of digital divide, there's been a digital divide, you know, for a long time, right? And then but also if we think of the pace of technological change in my lifetime, I'm, you know, in my 50s, it's pretty dramatic. And I would be curious on the, and first of all, I'm so glad that you're collecting this data. I think this data is critical for us to understand where we're going. I think of my mother, who is 77 years old. She bought an iPhone and she cannot figure out how to swipe it on. And I keep saying, well, you put this much pressure and you swipe it, and she cannot do it. And she gets so mad at me, because, you know, it's my fault, and I've tried everything, and she just thinks technology is designed to make her be falling behind. She really is very suspect of it across the board. And so you have certainly those digital divides. I would be curious, in the studies that you were doing, how are you helping? Once again, being from the United States, it's very tricky what we can do here in the United States as far as asking people to self-identify. But is there a way that you've asked the questions that you can get people, if they want to identify what their age is, or do they have a disability, or do they have something that is that they believe is causing them to be more in the digital divide than others? I don't know if I'm asking that correctly, but okay.
So I think so. The first point says it's an anonymous survey. Some of the questions that we were asking are very much trying to understand how people kind of feel about some of the technologies or services at the edge. Some of those things don't exist yet, or people may be uncomfortable talking about. The only thing that we asked was the age group, the gender, education, and where in the world that you were. But I think within that, it's still there's some insight that we can gain. So, for example, as I said earlier, it's quite obvious on many of the questions that there's an age divide. The younger you are, the more likely you are to feel more comfortable about using the technology or services that we've talked about. There are some exceptions to that. One of those exceptions is where the technology in question has a benefit to you as an individual from a health point of view. So, for example, we asked a question about how would you feel about nanobots in your bloodstream, and that being an example that maybe it's not there today, as far as I know, but we could envisage that could be there to help people in terms of fighting disease or something like that. We asked people in terms of augmentation, technological augmentation of you, whether that was a chip under the skin from a payment point of view, or a limb augmentation, or we asked it in a number of different ways. I think what was interesting is that that particular set of questions, there isn't a difference in the age group. That no matter what age group you are, whether you are under 20 or over 60 or anything in between, the view about that particular thing was broadly the same. Some of those are more acceptable than others. Yeah. So I think the example I used around nanobots in your bloodstream, it's not to say that's entirely popular with everybody, but it was uniformly about the same view. Interestingly, people were more comfortable with nanobots in your bloodstream than they were about a natural voice interface with some of the products that we're seeing in the market at the moment, which was a big surprise for me. But we have to hypothesize about some of the why. We didn't ask at that point, why have you answered in that particular way? We were trying to get the initial kind of set of data that gave us, if you like, a global feeling per geography or per age group about that particular technology. Christopher?
Absolutely. And what I've been most interested in is to see at what point the digital divide is most acute, and there's the most between age groups or location, and at which point actually it becomes most flat, and we'll have for example, we've had a respondents from Asia responding to our survey, and there we found that people over the age of 60 in Asia are actually more positive on average across all questions age of 30, which is, I suppose you might say, surprising, but it might indicate where society and the context surrounding the people within it is progressing in different ways, perhaps between Western and Eastern, maybe. So yeah.
I think there are. I mean, we asked. There's another example of a question about how people feel about a gig economy, which is obviously kind of changing some of the nature of employment and the way that we work, and engage in some of the digital tools to enable us to do work in that kind of space. Now, I think a reasonably high percentage of people weren't positive about working in a gig economy. But what we haven't done is to try and segment it in any different way, because I would imagine that there are parts of our society that would actually see that as an opportunity to work more easily for anybody on a global basis than having to kind of worked in some of the other ways. So I think we can make we can make judgments, hypotheses about why some of the results are the way that they are looking. But the only thing that we actually kind of asked people was age or age group, gender, geography, and educational background.
I have another example of where that's come clearly in our survey results so far. We asked a question on designer babies and DNA to change the characteristics of the child, and we found that had a significant disparity in results between senior and younger people. More comfortable with the idea, even though across the board it was a relatively speaking, a disliked topic, and that might indicate broader on us and our perceptions of technology. Perhaps it's ways that you see in the news versus the cool stuff that we see on social media. When people start to be in different conversations, literally, between the physical and the online social media world, that could be driving different perspectives in our, which is something that I think we can explore more.
Okay, I'm interested in the optimism of the older generations in Asia, and I do wonder whether or not that's because they see the health benefits and everything else, and are maybe not as clued in to some of the things that they're paying for through their data that some of the younger generations are aware of, because there's a lot of free stuff out there which seems, you know, it's great. There's all of these free apps and all of these things that I can get for nothing, whereas I used to pay for services that and I'm getting all of this stuff for free. What they maybe don't understand is the digital footprint that they're leaving behind. So I think maybe that's something that people in the younger age group are aware of. That, and it's an interesting flip, because I think that maybe 10 years ago they were the ones that were giving away their data freely and were very gung-ho about what they shared and everything else. And I think that as we've seen, you know, social media coming back and biting people sometimes, that maybe that's created a change in attitudes. But I am still really curious, and it's interesting that there is this optimism about the power of technology. Maybe, you know, the younger generation is just a little bit more dystopian, because let's face it, it's unfortunately the younger generations are probably going to be less well off than their parents, and this is the first time that that's ever happened in modern society. So that's something that might might trigger that, but whether that's just towards tech, I don't know. I think that the other things that I'm very interested in are things like virtual reality and augmented reality, because I think that those are, things on the horizon. Yes, the technology's here, but in terms of mass adoption, it's still some way off. But they hold real potential to be with augmented reality, to be able to add layers of information, layers of help for people. And one of the things that I have seen with virtual reality is stuff that is being done by the AARP, which I think was called the American Association of Retired Persons. They've changed the name to something slightly more correct and less retiree focused now. But they were using virtual reality to give people tours of places that they hadn't been to for years and years. So they were going into old people's homes and putting on the virtual reality headsets, and people were loving that. So I think that there are definitely applications for both, but please expand.
I mean, it's fair to say that we asked a number of questions looking at VR, looking at gaming, look at communication within gaming, and it's certainly kind of one of the areas that I've been fascinated with for many years, has been the interaction of people over distance through games. I think it's probably fair to say that a much smaller percentage than I expected have responded positively about experiences such as use of VR, such as communicating with people through massive online kind of games. I think what that I'm not sure what that shows actually. It'll be interesting as we kind of begin to analyze that data in a lot more detail. But certainly when I can again make hypotheses about what that might mean within some of the work environment where we see people using social-based tools to interact and collaborate and communicate. I think kind of it probably works far better for people who are naturally kind of communicating, collaborating, using those AR, VR experiences in gaming as well, because they're naturally used to it. One of the fascinating differences, again, coming from the data around VR, was on the whole, the likelihood is that male respondees were more likely to be comfortable with those game technologies or VR than female. It's only slightly. It's one of the very few examples where there is some gender difference. Apart from women over 60, who seem to be more understanding and trusting of VR. And again, so that's what the data says. We might then try and work out, well, why is that? I'll take my own example of my kids have got a VR headset. So maybe it's that their grandparents have kind of, and my mother have seen them play with it, kind of maybe slightly less fear than somebody who hasn't seen it. I don't know. But in the sense that as we come to the end of the year and begin to get a bit more data to kind of look through in a bit more detail, maybe we'll get a bit better view as to kind of why some of those outliers are the case. But completely agree, Neil, in terms of the technologies like VR, AR, understanding the impact of AI, machine intelligence, and the way that people feel about that is going to be a key aspect of the survey. One of the other great areas was we asked a question around how do you feel about AI running government, which is maybe a bit of a controversial question, and one that it's probably fair to say is people are not comfortable about quite highly. But again, it wasn't universal. In certain geographies, then there was a statistically different perspective around the use of AI within government. So again, kind of we can then begin to kind of work out, well, okay, so from a trust point of view, from a feeling point of view, what might that indicate? Christopher, do you want to build on that?
I think the AI running the country one's fantastic. I don't know if you saw talking about the idea of digital ghosts recently, where you could around a human over a period of time and then protract their life onwards if they were to pass away, and have their decision making and influencing live on beyond their usual form. So we could have Donald Trump with us for much longer than we do today in a different capacity, or at least be able to know what they might have done in a scenario. So in a near-term future, that might not be as today. I'm really excited about these cutting-edge ones, but I'm also interested in the more fundamental technologies that I feel naturally use. So one of our most disliked in our top 10 was around posting images and video on social media. And most of them is on YouTube, and watching peers of my own age group putting videos online and in their day, vlogging themselves, gaming, all that stuff. It's part of my entertainment and general lifestyle. And for that to be such a disliked, tells me a lot about how people are viewing privacy in this future world, actually something to open themselves up in that kind of way to the broader public. And as our society becomes more sociable out of our physical interactions, interesting to see how that's tested.
Well, I did for some time what I call digital inclusion training for a group of people, and there, no, most of them, they were older than 60, and the oldest was on their 80s. And I feel that sometimes it's not, I have that feeling that sometimes it's not technology that creates a divide, but the narrative around technology that creates that same divide. And sometimes when I was talking with my students at the time, I realized that when they were trying to use Skype, when they were trying to use online banking, they just wanted to do one thing right. They were not wanted to explore all the high-end features of Skype or Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or even banking. They just wanted to do something that was working for them. And when you go through the tutorials and the information provided by these companies, you'd really have anything that relate to them and could help them to do what they actually needed. Even when they were trying to find training or ways to learn more about technology, they were into classes where people were trying to teach them Google documents or how to use Word, and there's nothing of their interest into that. So my question, do you think that that's still the case, that sometimes technology is not the problem, but the narrative that we are creating around it that is responsible for people being suspicious or not being so confident with the technology that we are building?
Okay, so I'm going to take you up on that point, because I think that obviously we are introducing layer upon layer of complexity into our interfaces, and that is problematic, especially for people who either have cognitive difficulties or who are older and may not be familiar. However, I also think that this is an area where potentially artificial intelligence and machine learning can help. So if Hector Minto from Microsoft is going to owe me a beer here. I'm going to talk about Office, because essentially in Office there is something called Tell Me, and you can just start typing into the latest version of Office what it is that you want to do, and it will use and suggest things that it thinks are relevant, and it's pretty good. So if you want to reduce the size of pictures in your PowerPoint presentation because you can't send it because it's too big, you can type that in, and it will take you to that part of the application, which is great because you don't have to find out how to navigate around menus or anything else. You just have to tell the computer what it is you want to do. Obviously, the one flaw is that you need to know where the Tell Me feature is in the first place. But I think it holds potential.
And I think a core hypothesis of the work that we've been doing, I mean, the examples there have been older people kind of understanding and how to use devices or services. Neil, the example you give there is about how you use assistive or intelligent kind of advice in an automated fashion to make things easier. Our core hypothesis has been, with this wave of new technologies coming one after the other, then there is this continual divide that exists. So if we say, how do we get 70-plus-year-olds to use tablets or PCs or communicate using YouTube, well, that's one thing. But how about getting 40 and 50-year-olds to kind of get their heads around blockchain and how that might be utilized by them, or 20 to 30-year-olds to get their head around quantum computing? And clearly there are examples very successful in each of those kind of categories. But what we're talking about is at a societal level, and how society or communities, in a widest sense, get comfortable with the benefits that can be driven through these technologies. And we do continually get hooked up in things like utopian versus dystopian visions, and especially when we talk about things like AI and machine intelligence, etc. And we can totally get caught up in things like politics or economic models. Not that that's something that we're explicitly looking at in the survey, but we have to be conscious that there is this link between these technologies and how they're used to shape society. And I think simply what we're trying to do here is understand some of the barriers and trust barriers, especially, to then work out how we lessen those to make it more used by more of society for their benefit in the widest sense.
My addition to that would be, when we talk about society and bring in this new technology to kind of drag us along to its adoption, if we think about who's actually doing that, it's the large corporations, it's the Apples and the Microsofts of this world. And I think there's also an element of the so what. Okay, so we found out that people are uncomfortable with this element of technology. What do we do with that? Well, actually, if we can build advice on the back of it, influence corporate decision making, have sort of a corporate social responsibility 2.0, as it were, for how people should technology in a way that is cognizant of people that might feel uncomfortable with it, then that would be hugely valuable.
I think kind of the only thing I was going to add was the survey is still running. And actually what would be great is to get as many more responses as we possibly can. We've got a great representation across a number of countries. I think kind of the top few are UK, India, Netherlands, US, Germany, Spain, France, and then a number across Asia. So it'd be great to get more, especially in Africa, especially South America, would be great to kind of get a bit more input. And especially in the younger and the older age groups as well. We've got a great mix across the middle. But some more either side. It's been a fantastic set of responses so far, but the more that we can get, the more insight that it will bring. There's only 43 questions. It sounds a lot, but actually it's about 10 minutes to complete it. We've got it in English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Mandarin, so it's available in multiple languages as well. Trying to kind of reach out to as many people as possible, and it has been, I mean, it's obviously kind of, we're talking Twitter today, it's been great to engage with people on Twitter across the world. Very brief story, had a conversation with somebody in the Congo. It was a kind of digital technology group in the Congo, and they said, can we have the survey in French, please? And so a week later we kind of got it to them in French, and we've had kind of responses from the Congo. So there's been many examples like that. The more the better. I would love to do this survey on a yearly basis, because it would be fascinating to see how it evolves over time and how people's perception changes. But I thought I'd just kind of put in a plug.
Yeah, and it's open for till the end of December.
Till the end of the year, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. That's right. Yeah, fantastic. And I think that we will learn a lot of stuff from people's attitudes. I need to thank Barclays for their support and making sure that we can keep the lights on and make sure that the captions are done quickly and timely. I think that they're a good example of an organisation that is thinking about these things too. We're very much keen to push organisations and large companies and of course governments to be thinking about digital inclusion. It's something that is really important if we want an inclusive and fair society. I don't know whether you noticed, but actually UK government made an announcement last Thursday. The Department for International Development made the announcement that that future UK aid needs to include the consideration of how you can include people with disabilities. So one of the investment criteria will be how inclusive is UK aid going forward. So I think this is a really positive step. I'd like to see more organisations taking decisions based upon the idea of inclusion. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today, guys. We will absolutely enjoy having you online tomorrow night for Twitter. You can share with us your one vision for, actually it's multiple visions for a digital society. It'd be really great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. And
Thank you,
Antonio
Neil.
and Deborah.
Thank you, everyone. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Yes, thanks everyone. Great topic. Very, very interesting.